Sirens of a trade war are blaring. In one sweep, Washington orders 27 nations to slap 100% tariffs on every Chinese product, a demand larger than any sanction in modern history. But by the time the ink dries, the plan is in freefall. Germany warns of 500,000 jobs lost. France fears its billion-euro luxury market wiped out. Eastern Europe warns entire factories could go dark in days. And as Europe hesitates, Beijing strikes back, threatening to choke off rare earth supplies that keep U.S. missiles flying and EVs running. What began as America's grand offensive is collapsing before the world's eyes, and no one knows what comes next. Why did the United States press so many countries at once? The public rationale linked China to Moscow's lifeline. Officials argued that Beijing's surging purchases of Russian oil and gas, worth an estimated $62 billion in 2024, according to Chinese customs data reported by Reuters on August 12th, allowed the Kremlin to finance its war. The White House framed tariffs on China as an indirect tool to choke Russian energy revenue. But allies immediately questioned whether this logic could hold. After all, oil tankers move on contracts signed months in advance. A customs tariff in Europe or North America would not erase those obligations overnight. The scale of the request made the skepticism sharper. The European Commission was already facing its own domestic crisis over steel. On October 1st, 2025, Reuters confirmed Brussels was preparing to halve steel import quotas and impose tariffs of up to 50% above those limits. That measure alone risked provoking supply shortages for construction firms across the continent. Adding a 100% duty on all Chinese goods, as U.S. envoys were urging, would mean crippling car makers, electronics assemblers, and pharmaceutical distributors who rely on Chinese inputs. Germany in particular voiced unease. Bloomberg reported on September 28 that Berlin's exports to China had reached 97 billion euros in 2024, making China its second largest market after the United States. German auto groups had already lost ground in China to local EV rivals. A new tariff barrier risked accelerating that erosion by handing market share to Korean and Japanese competitors. French officials raised parallel concerns about cosmetics, noting that in 2024, French beauty exports to China grew 14% year over year, according to customs data cited by the Financial Times. A punitive duty would destroy that momentum overnight. Washington, however, was not acting from a position of strength. On September 30th, 2025, U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer told reporters that current tariffs on Chinese imports, averaging 55%, were a good status quo. He warned that if negotiations failed, the rate could jump to 145%. Reuters carried his words verbatim, and the market reaction was immediate. Semiconductor shares dropped more than 4% in New York, while agricultural exporters feared China would retaliate again. This was not theoretical. On April 4, 2025, Beijing had imposed 34% additional tariffs on all United States goods and tightened export restrictions on rare earth minerals, according to Reuters. Those measures disrupted United States defense supply chains within weeks. The timing also intersected with fragile economic signals at home. The IMF's April 2025 World Economic Outlook lowered United States growth forecasts for 2025 to 1.9%, down from 2.4%. At the same time, it raised the probability of a United States recession in 2026 to 40%. Tariffs were officially justified as reciprocal measures, but, many economists saw them as political instruments. Wall Street Journal columnist Greg Ip wrote in May 2025 that tariff escalation had become a substitute for fiscal policy at a moment when congressional gridlock prevented new stimulus. That hypothesis really resonated with investors, who noted that household prices had already surged 12% for tariff-affected goods in the second quarter of 2025, according to Bureau of Labor Statistics data. China, meanwhile, demonstrated both resilience and caution. When the United States raised duties to a historic peak of 145% in early May, Beijing did not respond immediately. Instead, it waited until negotiations in Geneva on May 12th. That day, Reuters confirmed both governments had agreed to slash most additional tariffs. The United States from 145% to 30% and China from 125% to 10%. For 90 days, a fragile truce held. Trade flows stabilized, and shipping data from Lloyd's List showed container volumes between Shanghai and Los Angeles rebounding 9% in June compared to April. The lesson was clear. Escalation could be reversed when political costs outweighed benefits. But reversals cut both ways. By July 22nd, as Trump landed in Manila to negotiate a Philippine military access deal, Reuters reported that absent further agreement, tariffs could snap back to extreme levels. 145% on United States imports from China, 125% on Chinese imports from the United States. This snapback clause haunted investors. It implied that every temporary truce carried the risk of sudden collapse. European allies watching this volatility questioned whether anchoring their own economies to such a volatile policy was rational. India's position made the calculus harder still. On August 6th, the White House released a fact sheet accusing New Delhi of undermining sanctions by buying record volumes of Russian crude. By 2025, Reuters reported, Russian oil made up 37% of India's imports. 3 weeks later, Trump signed an order imposing an additional 25% tariff on Indian goods. Yet India did not reduce purchases. Analysts noted that Russian oil discounts of up to $12 per barrel made the trade irresistible. For European governments, this was evidence that punitive tariffs alone could not compel behavioral change. Inside the European Union, divisions widened. Hungary and Slovakia, heavily reliant on Chinese integrated supply chains, warned that a blanket tariff could paralyze their domestic factories. Poland, aligned more closely with United States security positions, signaled openness but demanded exemptions for agricultural machinery. Italy hesitated, knowing that Chinese tourism brought €6 billion in receipts in 2024 according to Eurostat. The European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, offered only ambiguous words. In a September policy document reviewed by the Financial Times, she wrote that Europe must balance strategic autonomy with global cooperation. Diplomatic sources interpreted that as a refusal to endorse Washington's demand. The collapse of momentum was visible in trade data. Eurostat's August 2025 release showed EU imports from China still accounted for 21.3% of external imports, up slightly from the year before. Exports to China represented 8.3% of EU outbound trade. Cutting those ties with a sudden 100% tariff would mean erasing nearly 1/10 of the bloc's export revenues in a single stroke. For Germany, that would equate to the loss of more than 400,000 jobs tied directly to China trade, according to estimates by the IFO Institute published in the Financial Times on September 18th. The United States did have leverage, its market size and legal tools. On September 25th, Politico reported Trump had announced steep new duties, 100% on pharmaceuticals unless firms were building U.S. plants, 25% on heavy trucks, 50% on kitchen cabinets and vanities, and 30% on upholstered furniture. These moves were targeted, sectoral, and immediate. They demonstrated Washington's capacity to inflict costs unilaterally. Yet, they also undercut the narrative that America needed allies to act first. If tariffs could be applied with a pen stroke at home, why demand 27 governments take the lead abroad? That contradiction eroded credibility. European officials speaking anonymously to Reuters on September 29th said they doubted the U.S. request was serious. One described it as performative pressure, meant to signal toughness rather than produce a real coalition. Another argued that Washington's true aim was negotiating leverage with Beijing, using the specter of a united front as a bargaining chip. In that interpretation, the collapse of the plan was not failure but function. The threat had served its purpose. Still, threats carry costs. China accelerated outreach to Latin America, announcing in late September a $10 billion credit line for infrastructure projects in Brazil and Argentina, according to Bloomberg. At the same time, Beijing deepened its swap line with the Bank of Thailand, boosting yuan liquidity for regional trade. By diversifying partners, China reduced vulnerability to Western tariff coordination. This adaptation really underscored the limits of coercion. By late September, the question was no longer whether 27 countries would align on 100% tariffs. They would not. But what the fallout meant for global order. Investors braced for more fragmentation. The WTO warned in its September trade outlook that global merchandise trade volume would contract 1.2% in 2025, its steepest decline since the pandemic, if tariff barriers persisted. The OECD, in a parallel forecast, cut projected EU growth to 0.8% for 2025, citing escalating trade restrictions as a primary risk. At the White House, officials insisted the strategy remained intact, yet court filings suggested fragility. The FT reported in late September that challenges to Trump's use of emergency powers under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act were moving rapidly toward the Supreme Court. Greer, anticipating limits, argued that alternative statutes like Section 301 and Section 232 would keep tariffs alive. This legal maneuvering revealed just how contested the tariff apparatus had become within the United States itself. The collapse then was multi-layered. The external coalition crumbled because allies balked. The internal mechanism faced judicial uncertainty, and the global market response showed that even floated threats triggered capital flight. The Dow fell 2.1% on September 30th, its worst single-day drop since March, after reports of the U.S. outreach to allies. Commodity prices spiked. Copper gained 3% on expectations of disrupted Chinese supply, while soybean futures dropped on fears of Chinese retaliation. By October 1st, diplomats acknowledged reality. The 27-nation tariff front had dissolved. Europe would pursue narrower steel quotas. The U.S. would escalate selectively. China would retaliate with calibrated moves. The global economy, caught between these oscillations, faced uncertainty as structural condition rather than temporary disturbance. And so the final image is not of signatures on a shared document, but of absence-empty chairs at a Brussels summit table where unity was supposed to be declared. The plan collapsed not in drama, but in silence, which raises the unresolved question. If America cannot bind its allies to tariff war, and if China cannot be isolated through coercion, is the world entering an era where economic warfare achieves nothing but erosion on all sides? We're glad you're enjoying this video. Please like and subscribe. Check out another video that is now on your screen.